Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Andrew Wilson. At this time of year, we all have Christmas traditions, which are an annual feature of the festive celebrations. Arguing over whose turn it is to open the Advent calendar today. Stopping me from pointing out that when I was growing up, when you opened the door of an Advent calendar, you got a drawing of a wee bell, not a chocolate or a sweetie. And of course, debating whether or not it is too early to start drinking. At Broadcasting Scotland, we have our own traditions, and that is why we're here today with the full Scottish Review of the Year, Part 2. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by two of our regular and very special guests. Firstly, we're joined by Maureen Watt, who was a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011, and she was then the member of our Scottish Parliament representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine until 2021. Maureen is a former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen, how are you keeping?
Yeah, grand, thank you. Yeah, just flying about trying to get things ready for Christmas.
Of course. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland today. And we're also lucky enough to be joined by Linda Fabiani, who served as the SNP member of our Scottish Parliament representing East Kilbride from 1999 until she retired at the election in 2021. When she retired, Linda was the Deputy Presiding Officer of our Parliament. Linda, how are you keeping?
I'm absolutely fine, Andrew, but I have to make a wee correction to how you introduced me. Oh, yeah.
Tell me.
Yeah, like Maureen, I was a regional list member from 99, and it was 2011 when we had such a great result in the election in Scotland that I became the representative for East Kilbride, which was wonderful.
So we were both elected as constituency MSPs at the same election?
We certainly were.
There we go. Oh, well, the devil's in the detail, and I'm always ready to be corrected by both you and Maureen, Linda. Thank you. Let's look at our first item today, because today we're going to be looking at March and April of 2023, reflecting on the headlines and the news stories that were important in those 2 months. And firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about domestic energy policy. In those months in 2023, in March and April, we saw the energy price guarantee. The domestic energy market, of course, is reserved to Westminster, and we saw the UK government unveil a new energy strategy, which became a matter of some controversy, both in terms of the way it was designed, the way in which it supported the electricity companies and the power generators, and also whether or not it was having the necessary positive effect on the people who were in receipt of that energy price guarantee. So the question is, did it go far enough? From a Scottish perspective, particularly for those who live off the natural grid. And also, I think it's probably relevant, given that domestic energy policy is reserved to Westminster, to perhaps consider a little bit about what a Scottish government, if it had the powers, as the Northern Ireland Assembly does, with regard to domestic energy, what a Scottish government might have done instead and could have done better. So firstly, Maureen, if I can come to you first, in terms of the Westminster's approach to the domestic energy market and the energy price guarantee, do you think that guarantee and that policy went far enough, especially for those who are in a sense are lucky enough, in particular in Scotland, for those who live off the natural gas grid?
Well, it's really difficult if you live off the gas grid because clearly you need, oil or wood, and it's, you're not guaranteed to be able to source always these things. So you haven't got a kind of regular supply that you just switch on and things happen. You've got to get it topped up or whatever. So it's really difficult if you are off grid. But I think the big point, Andrew, is that Scotland is energy rich but fuel poor. And until we have full control of our energy policy, there's very little we can do about it. Although I'm old enough to remember when it was Margaret Ewing as an MP who fought for the winter fuel payment. So we really are reliant on the Westminster government to help people with the the rising energy prices, because gas is linked to oil, and the oil price is worldwide. So it does rely on governments to help their citizens cope with this huge spike in energy prices. And while, something's better than nothing, it hasn't stopped people falling into fuel poverty. And with the cost of living increases, it's just misery upon misery piled on our citizens.
Thanks, Maureen. And Linda, I was going to ask you, what was your sense of the way in which Scottish voters and Scottish electricity customers and gas customers received the energy price guarantee, and perhaps whether in that context you picked up any thoughts as to how it might have been done better in Scotland, perhaps by a Scottish government?
Well, I think there was a feeling generally that whilst there was a grant given supposedly to help people meet the costs of their fuel, it was quite clear, and the perception was of many, many people, that what the UK government was actually more concerned about was protecting the power companies, the electricity and gas companies. And people didn't feel, and still don't feel, that they're the ones who are foremost at the thoughts of those who make the decisions. What could we do better? Well, there's lots. Maureen has already talked about some of that. But for me, it's the big picture that's so often missed. It's about, the fact that so many decisions are made for the benefit of shareholders of private companies and not about the consumers. So the Scottish Government, any Scottish Government in an independent Scotland, a Scottish Government of any persuasion, could make the decision to do things differently in the big picture. For example, you could talk about proper price capping on the costs of energy to households and to businesses. You could talk about more of an emphasis on the consumer than on the shareholder. And you could even go as far as to talk about nationalising some elements of our power. And of course, the resources Scotland has for wind and water energy and all the work that's going on in renewables could come much more into the fore if we had a Scottish Government that was able to make all the decisions to the benefit of the population. And one of the things that is so crucial is to be able to keep warm, having shelter, having enough to eat, being able to live comfortably. That's how people get that sense of well-being. And I'm afraid that's sadly lacking at the moment, because the cost of living in all elements is so difficult for people, and folk are really, really worried about the present and indeed about the future.
Thanks, Linda. Excuse me. And just to follow up a little bit on that, just briefly, do you think that there is an argument? Do you think we should be moving towards making shelter the right to a home, the right to somewhere to live, making that a human right in Scotland?
I am all for, defining what rights people have, the very, very basic rights of a decent life. My only concern sometimes, Andrew, is that we make big statements and are not always able to follow them up. So it's twofold. It's recognising that right, and certainly the SNP government in Scotland are talking about a Bill of Rights to do things like that. But you also need to have the resources as well as the will to be able to carry these things out. And that's why I have faith that an independent nation that can make its own decisions would be far better able to meet these aspirations, and indeed to be held to account if these aspirations are not met.
Thanks, Linda. Some great perspective. I'm very grateful to you both. But we'll move on to our next item now, because by March and April in 2023, UK refugee policy was continuing to get very close attention in the press and in the courts and in elsewhere. The mantra from the from Westminster, from the Tory government, from the Prime Minister. One of his 5, what were originally promises, then pledges, then undertakings, then I'm not sure what they are now, was to stop the boats. And of course, we know that that really has not happened this year. Trade unions at this time were accusing the UK government of being complicit in asylum seeker in the attacks and the picketing of hotels where asylum seekers were being housed and homed. And of course, it was becoming apparent that Afghan journalists, soldiers, and others who'd worked for the UK government in Afghanistan had become stranded, either in Pakistan, from where they're now being expelled, or in Afghanistan itself, and were suffering as a result of that set of circumstances. So, Maureen, to come to you first, do you think, is there any aspect of the Westminster attitude and approach to refugees and asylum seekers, is there any aspect of Westminster's policy which works?
In a word, no, in my view. It's just a complete and utter mess, and they really don't know what they're going to do apart from repeating constantly the mantra of stopping the boats, because they think it appeals to their right-wing supporters, forgetting, of course, that the vast majority of the population don't support these extreme views. And I think this is where Scotland and England diverge most, because in Scotland we need people coming to help grow our economy. For the first time in many years, the population of Scotland is falling, mostly as a result of Brexit. And we need people here to come and do the work that is required, and, as I say, grow the economy. So really, Scotland is being hamstrung in terms of going for growth because of this policy. And the number of people coming across the Channel has increased since Brexit. And we, as you mentioned, Andrew, seeing that people who were promised asylum, like journalists and Afghanis who helped the British troops, are not being allowed to come in, which is just unbelievably cruel in my view. So Scotland definitely needs a different migration policy. Scotland has always been welcoming of refugees and asylum seekers, and asylum seekers is something that Linda spent a lot of time promoting as an MSP. So it's one of the key issues, I think, that the next election should be fought on, insofar as Scotland needs a completely different policy from what is being pursued in England currently, and looks like it's being continued by a Labour government if that comes in.
Thanks, Maureen. And just briefly, do you think that do you sense an appetite from the Scottish government or from the SNP group at Westminster to campaign actively on that topic, to take the argument? I was going to say take the fight, but I'm not going to say that. To take the argument and to set up the argument dynamically and with energy as part of the general election campaign next year.
Well, I think that is what we should be doing, but of course it's fraught with difficulty, given that the mainstream media will take the rest of the UK perspective on this. But I think it's certainly something that our campaigners and members will be highlighting on the doorstep.
Thanks, Maureen. We'll look forward to seeing how that campaign is shaped. But Linda, when we were talking about energy policy a moment ago, and human rights in particular, you were talking about the contrast or the tension between policy aspiration and policy delivery. Whilst state writing down policies are great, delivering on them is a very, very different matter. And I suspect that's something that the Home Office has been proving probably for about 25 years that I can remember. So do you think, in terms of refugee policy and asylum seeker policy at Westminster, what do you think that Westminster should and must change first?
Oh, Could do a whole programme on this, Andrew. There's a very, very basic issue for me. You know, since I was ever elected, and indeed before it, I've been disgusted by UK government policy on refugees, asylum seekers, which are different things, and those who wish to immigrate into the UK, which again is a different thing. I have to say that since this particular Tory government came in, my disgust just reaches no end at the way they deal with this. And I think one of the very basic issues is that they refuse constantly to make a distinction between asylum seekers and immigrants. And they are very, very different things. They completely ignore the international obligations from the United Nations that they've signed up to about how asylum seekers should be treated. These are people who are fleeing very often the most awful of circumstances. So they tie in with immigration, and some of the rhetoric that this government uses is abhorrent. You know, we're going to be flooded with immigrants, this, that, and the next thing, taking our jobs, taking our houses. Awful. And there's something that seriously puzzles me, saddens me, and not a lot of people speak about it. But you know, I am a product of immigration. My grandfather came from Italy and left poverty, came to Glasgow along with others from his family, others from the village, and worked his bahookie off, making a good life for his family and also serving the community in which he settled. That's what immigrants do. And I have to say, Andrew, I find it really, really bizarre that we have a government which has many products of immigration, I'm delighted to say, because you know I think it's wonderful that those who come from immigrant families end up in position of power. That's what any healthy society should have. But I find it truly bizarre that these same children of immigrants are so nasty and horrible to others who want to take the same opportunities for their families. And that's what we're seeing day and daily from the Westminster government. And as I say, I'm stuck for words as to why that is. But I think the big problem is refusing to recognise the difference between asylum and indeed refugees, which is slightly different, and immigration. But it's a deliberate policy of the UK government to do that in these dog whistle politics, as we call it, just to try and gain popular support. And they make scapegoats out of entirely innocent people by so doing. As well as that, there is the complete incompetence of how they deal with things. You know, the length of time that people have to wait for asylum decisions, complete incompetence. And then, as yourself alluded to, and Maureen, the way that they have treated, for example, Afghani translators and others who have worked for the UK and compromised their own safety by so doing, just get the door shut on them completely. I think it's a disgusting and horrible way to treat any fellow human being, but they seem to do it without thought or conscience.
Thanks, Linda. Some pretty powerful words there that I don't think Maureen and I would have any objection to whatsoever. But your point's very well made. I suspect that with maybe a couple of decades perspective, we can unleash the psychiatrists and the psychologists who can tell us why a Home Secretary, a Prime Minister and a Foreign Secretary, all of whom are the sons and daughters of immigrants, have such radical and extreme anti-immigrant, anti-refugee and anti-asylum views. But that's for the psychologists and the psychiatrists in due course. So let's move on now a little bit, because as March and April moved on, the BBC and the media was a regular topic for discussion. with, of course, the careful but powerful language that Gary Lineker was using in his tweets, getting almost constant attention from right-wing hacks and the GBB's news. And then, of course, on the 28th of April, Richard Sharp resigned as the BBC chair after he breached the rules on public appointments by failing to declare his connection and arranging a secret £800,000 loan to be made to Boris Johnson. So Linda and Maureen, none of we participated in those stories at the time. I suspect we weren't particularly surprised by either of them. Both the way in which Gary Lineker was monstered by the right-wing press, and also the extent to which the tentacles of the Conservative Party and its financial dealings were creeping into the most senior levels of BBC management. So the question, in a sense, is firstly for you, Maureen, do you think from a Scottish perspective or from a political perspective, is the BBC fulfilling its obligations at the moment?
No, and just during the lifetime of this extremely right-wing Conservative government, we have seen the BBC appearing to be more and more in their hands and spouting their line on things, to the extent that many people are just switching off from the BBC, and certainly our young folk are not getting their news from corporations like the BBC. So I think it's to the long-term detriment of the BBC. While the BBC are taking the government's line, at the same time, the government is constantly threatening to take away money from the BBC, but also threatening their license. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this Tory Westminster government would just like to get rid of the BBC and have us all watching GB News and the like, which would be absolutely horrific for free speech in this country. And you mentioned Gary Lineker. I mean, hats off to Gary Lineker. He's not employed by the BBC. Yes, he freelances for them, doing a very well-respected TV football punditry program, but he should not be subjected to the same rules of engagement, or if you like, or contract of employment as to full-time employees, and should be allowed to do whatever he likes when he's not broadcasting for them. So I think it was good of Gary Lineker to be one of the few people who would stand up to the might of the BBC and the government. And in terms of Richard Sharp, is it a surprise that he was seen to have given money to the Tory party and then gets this job? Absolutely not. We've seen cash for honours in the past, and to me it just shows the rotten system that Westminster has become, and the sooner that we are free from it in Scotland, the better.
Thanks, Maureen. And Linda, to broaden out the discussion a little bit about the media more generally, and we'll come back to this, I think, again later on in this programme, but it could be argued that we see the Scottish Government and the SNP under a prolonged media siege this year, perhaps kicking off with the Operation Branch Form, continuing into 2023, and the various performances we saw from the authorities during that. And so I was wondering, do you think, in terms of that, of the coverage of the SNP and the Scottish Government, do you think, is it normal for a country's media or another country's media that's broadcast in our country to appear to be of such a single-minded nature? You know, are there issues there for democracy? And I suppose, again, coming back to what we were talking about in terms of policy delivery, could or should broadcasting be devolved?
Absolutely, broadcasting should be devolved, and it's something that we have, as a government, been very upfront about since we took government in Scotland in 2007. You know, Scotland as a nation should not be content that there is a so-called national broadcaster who sticks a wee bit about Scotland in the end of their main news programmes, for example, and who runs a seemingly Scottish channel, which is no more than the way that a commercial radio show programme works, with silly news items and constant phone-ins. Beyond that as well, though, there seems to me that in the BBC, there is always a putting down of the SNP, therefore Scotland. It's just apparent throughout. And to get back to the discussion you started with, and with Maureen, they also seem to always support the establishment being unionist, the establishment being pretty right wing. We're seeing that over and over again. They never get hammered for it because their fellow establishment members in the right wing press just back it up all the time. I don't know how many pages Gary Lineker was on because of a few tweets that reaches a small audience. And more power to his elbow. Him and Carol Vorderman's another one I think's been doing good work on social media, but it is to a small audience. But you have the likes of the BBC promoting right-wing policies, unionist policies, promoting the likes of Nigel Farage all the time. How many times has he been in news programmes, when he didn't even have any representatives of his party who'd been elected? They do it all the time. Just as an example, the latest, what the heck's Michelle Mone doing all over the BBC? Getting interviewed by the top political commentators, etc., etc. I don't think you would ever see any what they call benefit scrounger getting interviewed by Laura Kuenssberg and being able to put their side of the story and saying something like, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that," but I think they're pathetic. I think it's time Scotland did have its own broadcaster. And when you look at the way even Wales, has a better broadcasting system than we do for Wales, Northern Ireland as well. And if you look at Ireland, the nation, everything they have is through the prism of their own country. And that's the way Scottish news programmes and broadcasting should be.
Thanks, Linda. Certainly with regard to Michelle Mone, it'll be interesting to see just how that story unfolds in all of its various aspects. I'm sure I've read recently that the online newspaper, The New European, is going to sue Michelle Mone and probably her husband as well for the legal costs they incurred in defending her various accusations that were made, which look rather like attempts by her on her own to invoke what would be called slaps nowadays in order to intimidate and prevent journalists from doing their jobs. And certainly it'll be interesting to see, thinking of the politics of this, if governments across Europe, which are replacing right-wing governments, so for example, Donald Tusk in Poland, whether they take steps to rein in state broadcasters who have been closely aligned to the previous right-wing governments, and whether steps can be taken on that. But we'll see how that unfolds. But let's move on now, because the 10th of April was the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. Now, while the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, locked Northern Ireland politicians into a power-sharing process, it was by 2023 becoming clear that the country that there was demand and there was clamour for the country to move on, in a sense, politically, and there was an appetite for another set of changes. So, Maureen, I'd like to talk to you first of all about what do you think are the prospects, given the political evolution that we've seen in Northern Ireland this year, an election in the middle of the year, and then the Stormont Assembly being suspended as a result of the DUP's action, but also the changes that we saw in the electoral process in terms of increasing support for Sinn Féin, increasing support for the Alliance Party, and perhaps too strong a word to say a fracturing, but a beginning of signs of division amongst the unionist politicians, and in particular in the DUP. Maureen, do you think what are the prospects for the next evolution in the post Good Friday Agreement politics in the north of Ireland?
Well, it's interesting to watch, and it clearly doesn't get as much attention from the UK mainstream media as it should, because of the way it is panning out in Northern Ireland. I think clearly, the Irish nationalists won the election and are the largest party and should lead any government in Northern Ireland when it's reformed, and that is clearly really upsetting the unionists throughout the rest of the UK. But it's in a backdrop of Northern Ireland seeing how the rest of Ireland is flourishing as still a member of the European Union. The GDP of Southern Ireland ERA is higher than in Scotland, and it's clearly flourishing, and people in the north are seeing that. So it's not just people who want a united Ireland that are seeing that they could do better still in the EU, which is what Northern Ireland voted for. And they're seeing the mess that borders in the middle of the Irish Sea are making. And the unionists, to any outsider, can just be seen, I think, as trying to cling on to power. And because they can't get power, they're stopping the legitimate government being run by Sinn Féin. So it'll be interesting to see whether something does happen in the new year. The DUP were saying, oh, we're not going to be constrained by timelines and end of the year and whatnot, even although they've been Northern Ireland have been offered a huge sweetener of something like £2.5 billion to get the government of Northern Ireland up and running. So it will be interesting to see how this pans out. I mean, I cannot think that the DUP can see anything other than further sliding down opinion polls and eroding support by their ridiculous stance on this, and not having a functioning government when their health service, for example, is the worst performing in the UK. The need for legislation and elected politicians doing their work there is really, really pressing. And I think Northern Ireland is suffering because of it. But Linda and I were in Northern Ireland a few months ago, and you could see that there was a kind of air of resignation among some people, and that isn't good for any society.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, thanks, Maureen, and that I'll carry the same question across to Linda, if I may. Actually, given as you say you were both in Northern Ireland in the course of 2023, Linda, what was your sense of there being any appetite or a growing appetite for political change, and perhaps to expand that a wee bit? Do you think there's any element of that which is driven by social policy change, given the extent to which the south of Ireland social policy might be argued to be significantly more progressive than it is in the north of Ireland?
Yeah, all of these things. Like Maureen, I felt a difference, and it was Belfast we were in. I mean, I was very privileged back in 2007 in the first SNP government in Scotland to have interacted with counterparts in the Irish Assembly, which of course was up and running then with power sharing. There was a great sense of optimism. Things were moving forward. And I was stunned by the way that Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley Sr. worked together, and I absolutely believe it was genuine. For whatever reasons, these two guys had decided that their country was more important than their own views, feelings, prejudices, whatever. And it seemed to be working. There was a great sense of optimism. One of the things I felt very strongly when Maureen and I were there was that things were going backwards. And it's really, really difficult, because can you recover from that? When people are apathetic completely about their own democracy and about those who are supposed to represent them. And let's not forget, there's very many genuine members of the Assembly there that are desperate to get back to working full time. There was a great sense of resignation, distrust, all of that. And that's really sad and takes a lot of work to get back. And, it's yet another failure of Rishi Sunak. He makes these great announcements and nothing happens. Was it the Windsor Accord, they called it, where he seemingly solved it all and it was going to get back to power sharing? My concern is that having gone backwards so far, and then the latest DUP refusal to move forward, then he could end up with direct rule back in Northern Ireland. What does that do to the Good Friday Agreement? This current UK government, this Tory UK government, have already driven a coach and horses through the Good Friday Agreement because of Brexit. They could damage it even more by ending up imposing direct rule, and that will be to the detriment of the peace process, and I believe to the detriment of the citizenry in Ireland.
Thanks, Linda. One aspect of the celebration of the anniversary, the celebration of the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, was that President Joe Biden himself, someone who's particularly proud of his Irish background and Irish family roots, he visited both the North and the South, and he made it he really demonstrated, I think it could be said, what a special relationship with the US actually means and what it can achieve. So Maureen, Maureen and Linda, I was going to look at it with you, both looking at the diaspora a little bit here. So Maureen, I was going to ask, do you think, are there differences in the way that the US relates to Ireland and the US relates to Scotland?
I'm not necessarily sure that the US treats us differently per se, but clearly, there were a huge number of Irish people who migrated because of poverty and famine to the United States, and people didn't ever forget their Irish roots, and that has been exploited very well by Ireland in the US, and that relationship has continued to flourish, both North and South, but obviously driven by South because they can do these sorts of things. Here in Scotland, at every turn, the UK government is trying to break our links with other countries, including the US. I mean, Tartan Week, although I've never been, I think you have, Linda, is a very successful showcase of Scotland in the US. And the Scotland office in the US is very successful as well. It's been staffed by some very good civil servants from Scotland, and Scottish Enterprise has a good office there too. And these organisations are continually working on promoting inward investment into Scotland. And I don't know what the figures are now, but prior to COVID, Scotland had the highest inward investment of any region of the UK apart from London and the southeast of England. So these links are really important in terms of growing our economy in Scotland. And the US is interested in investing in Scotland because of our well-educated population, our excellent universities and research institutes and so forth. So these links need promoting rather than destroying, which the current UK government is hell-bent on doing.
Thanks, Maureen. I was going to explore the diaspora a little bit more with you, Linda, but I'm
Yep.
watching the time as well, so we'll
Oh,
maybe carry that one over a wee bit. Well, actually, we've got a little bit of time. Let's have a look at it. I was going to ask you,
okay.
do you think should
I'll be,
Scotland's attitude to our diaspora evolve or change? Should our approach be a bit more like India or Ireland, and perhaps as part of the two-way relationship there? Should we be encouraging the Scottish diaspora, the current Scottish diaspora, to perhaps be a wee bit more Andrew Carnegie?
oh, well, Andrew Carnegie. I don't know if we should ever be a wee bit more Andrew Carnegie. There's another side to that man's history that we tend to ignore, which wasn't very nice.
True.
But,
True.
what I would say, Maureen was talking about, how poverty and things created the diaspora in Ireland. Of course it did, but we also have to look at why the perception of Ireland is very different in parts of the US, not all over, parts of the US compared to the Scottish diaspora. So it comes from that, but it also comes from the Troubles, and people who were fundraising for a united Ireland in the cities, in the east mainly of the US. That leaves its mark as well. I actually think Scotland is doing really well, in the terms of which Maureen spoke about. But there has been a move on from the UK government, as Maureen said, to stop Scotland promoting itself internationally. But to me, there's something we could do a lot better, and that is the promotion of our culture. And a lot of it is historical, why Ireland's culture is much more vibrant than ours overseas. Burns aside, that's a very special and very unique thing that we have. But the Irish, because they ended up as an independent nation when they did 100 years ago, and Northern Ireland stayed part of that cultural element in many ways, the Irish have been wonderful at promoting their music, their song, their poetry, their writing, really, really upfront. This is ours, this is wonderful. Our traditional music and other cultures for many, many years was diminished by Britishness that Scotland became part of. And I think that, call it soft diplomacy, I think we should be much more upfront about promoting our very unique culture in the US. We do a bit of it during Tartan Week, Scotland Week, in New York. I'd like to see a lot more of it. For example, when the National Theatre took the play Black Watch to the US, it was a huge success. And I would like to see us doing a lot more of that. And I think that would give a much wider perception of the differences in Scotland as compared to the rest of the UK. And it's not just about tartan, and it's not just about Robert Burns, wonderful though Robert Burns is. We should be doing more.
Thanks, Linda. Some great perspective there. Thank you. Now then, we'll come back to Scottish politics now, because this period of 2023 saw the end of an era, as Humza Yousaf was elected as party leader of the SNP on the 27th of March and was then elected by the Scottish Parliament to be First Minister on the 29th of March. Maureen, thinking about the speeches that Humza Yousaf made when he was elected leader of the party, and then perhaps at the convention, the Independence Convention in Dundee later that year. Maureen, what do you think? What are your thoughts on Humza's appointment, and in particular, do you think, with a little bit of perspective from where we are now at the end of 2023, do you think there has been a handing over to the next generation of politicians in the SNP, personified by Humza Yousaf, Stephen Flynn, and others?
Yes, although I think the way the change happened was a bit traumatic for the party and party members. We hadn't had an election for something like 20 years, and the sudden departure of Nicola was a shock to everybody. But I think that those who said that Humza is just a continuity candidate and was Nicola's choice is underrating Humza. I think that daily his stature grows as a different kind of leader. He's definitely putting his own stamp on the job, and I have seen him on the doorsteps. I have seen him campaigning in different situations, and he's really, really good at it. He relates to the electorate in a different way. And I think the way that Hamza is continuing to promote the well-being economy, continuing to promote Scotland as a world leader in climate change, is really important to Scotland, and it's being done in the most hostile environment that any leader could ever have imagined. The vilification on social media is absolutely appalling, and it is reflected in the mainstream media as well, or vice versa. But it's absolutely appalling. So it is incumbent on SNP members to really get behind Hamza, which I think they're doing, and promoting the new politics of Hamza Yousaf on the doorstep in the run-up to the general election.
Thanks, Maureen. And Linda, to continue to look at the timeline from that part of 2023, of course, a couple of weeks before Hamza Yousaf became leader of the SNP and First Minister, on the 18th of March, Peter Murrell had stepped down as the chief executive. And then, of course, on the 5th of April, after Hamza was appointed, Police Scotland pitched their tent, some might say parked their tank, on Nicola Sturgeon's lawn early in the morning of Wednesday, the 5th of April. So, Linda, I'll give you a choice. We can go in one of two directions with this one. Either does it Murray Foot is now the chief executive of the SNP. Does it matter much who is chief executive of a political party? Or alternatively, what do you think Police Scotland is going to do next?
Well, I can't say what I think Police Scotland is going to do next, because I don't think Police Scotland know what they're going to do next themselves. Does it matter who is chief executive? I think it does, because the one thing we should always remember in any political party that's worth its salt, the most important people of all are the members and volunteers. It's not all about those who are elected. It's not all about governments. It's the mainstay of the SNP is the membership. And the membership needs to be part of the greater thing, needs to feel it's part of it, needs to feel engaged with the party. So yes, it does matter who the chief executive is, because that chief executive, although he can't get round individually the many thousands of members that the SNP has, he can set the tone for the organisation at headquarters, and also be relating to elected members, whether it's councils, Scottish Parliament or Westminster, as to how they should also relate to the membership. So yes, it does matter. The person who's chief executive also has to be has to have integrity, has to be someone who can manage other people, because a political party has to run an organisation that's separate from government, separate from the elected members, and there's an awful lot of organisation required. It's not just setting up a big conference every year that ends up on the telly. It's making sure that all the branches right across the country feel that they are part of the organisation that is the SNP. So yes, it does matter. Murray Foot's made a good start. Hamza Yousaf, I second everything that Maureen has said about that. And we have the party is run by an executive elected by the membership, and both Hamza Yousaf and Murray Foot have to feed into that as well. So yes, both of these, I nearly said figureheads, and they're more than figureheads, of course they are, but both of these particular individuals in our party, whoever they may be, have to work in all different aspects of it.
That's a very good, very interesting perspective, Linda. I'm very grateful to you. It struck me while I was listening to you and thinking about what you were saying that maybe that's the point. For the Conservative Party, it's really the party treasurer who matters because he manages the big donors and manages that side of the business, which is most important to them. In the Labour Party, traditionally it's been managing the trade unions. And for the SNP, it's about working with and representing the rank and file members because it is they who fund and they who are so important in the SNP. So that was some great perspective. Thank you, Linda. But we'll move on again now because on the 18th of April, the First Minister, the newly appointed First Minister, Humza Yousaf, published a new policy prospectus setting out how the Scottish Government, his Scottish Government, would deliver for Scotland over the next 3 years. This was his first major statement to Parliament, and he said that there were 3 missions for his government centred on the themes of equality, opportunity, and community. Now, without rehearsing the policy prospectus at length, some of the highlights perhaps were a new deal for Scottish business, an explicit commitment to support economic growth for a purpose, which might well be taken to mean the growth of the well-being economy, confirmation of a further £1.3 billion invested in the Scottish Child Payment, improvement in cancer treatment, investment of £25 million converting suitable properties into affordable homes, in particular in remote, rural and island areas, introducing the 6-month pilot, removing peak time fares from ScotRail, in reinstating Scotland's participation in the Trends in International Mathematics and Science and Progress in Reading Literacy studies to properly compare counting and reading performance amongst Scotland's young people, and seeking a new agreement with COSLA to support the delivery of shared priorities with local authorities. So quite a broad policy prospectus there from the new First Minister. So I'll ask you both the same question. Maureen, I'll put you in the box seat. We'll go first. Humza Yousaf announced his new policy prospectus for government, as I say, on the 18th of April. Do you think what does that prospectus does it offer a fresh start or a fresh baseline for the Scottish Government and for the Scottish electorate?
Well, I think it was really important for Humza to put his stamp on his leadership and set out what his priorities would be. I think it's been very difficult for him to implement them because of the continued austerity from Westminster and no growth in the budget for our public services. And that is a really difficult background to be doing some of this, coupled with the fact that there is this continued onslaught that the SNP is not interested in business and growth, which is why Humza Yousaf and Neil Gray and others have been spending a lot of time working with business. I think the things like you mentioned, Andrew, about the child payment is really important. It does mean that child poverty in Scotland is much less than in England. And as I say, all this is in the background of a complete onslaught, concerted onslaught from our opponents in the media and in politics. But I think people on the ground are aware of everything that the Scottish Government is trying to do to eliminate poverty and to close the attainment gap. And we've seen that there has been progress made in that area with a very difficult background post-COVID. We also hear when things are looked at in a bit more detail that comparisons in the PISA study, for example, are not comparing like for like, and families themselves are seeing their children come out with more passes in higher and other grades than before. They're seeing their children go to positive destinations. We're seeing, I think, a completely different culture on ScotRail, for example. So there is progress being made, but as I say, against a very difficult background.
Yeah.
Thanks, Maureen. And Linda, the same question for you with regard to that that first policy prospectus, which Hamza Yousaf announced in April and then brought into the programme for government in the autumn. Did the policy prospectus for government, does it present an opportunity for a fresh start for Scotland and a fresh start for the Scottish electorate?
Yeah, well, it's like Maureen says, yes, but there are constraints because of the ongoing austerity programme of the UK government, but also the way the UK government seems to want to kick everything that Hamza Yousaf and the Scottish government do. So that's an issue. One of the things that I think looks like a new start. I love the way that he tied in with business economic growth for a purpose, because it's long been a frustration that everybody talks about economic growth as if it's the be all and end all and it's going to cure everything. It doesn't necessarily. And this emphasis that we've always had on gross domestic product, and why that shows economic growth and better times. It does for some people, but it doesn't for everyone. So economic growth for a purpose ties in with the well-being economy. So if you have economic growth, you should be able to use the fruits of that growth to make life better for people in general. That's quite clearly what Hamza's about, because it ties in with his equality opportunity agenda as well. There are constraints though. And that's why, again, it's always back to what we could do if we had all the decisions to take. And whilst Hamza Yousaf's programme, to me, will only be fully achievable to the level that I would want it, Maureen would want it, and indeed Hamza would want it, can only be achieved through Scotland being an independent nation and taking its own decisions. But he's going to do his damnedest to set us along that road. And I think that is what I am most happy about Hamza Yousaf as a leader.
Thanks, Linda. That's a very positive note on which to draw our discussion today to a conclusion, because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for today. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to continue to pay our bills is really pressing. Due to the generosity of our supporters, we've raised nearly £22,000. However, our need to raise the remaining £8,000 is now really urgent. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on X-Twitter, on Mastodon and on Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like, retweet, boost and reskeet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back tomorrow with the next full Scottish review of the year, so please come and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching us today, and of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guests, Maureen Watt and Linda Fabiani. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Indeed.
Please look after yourselves and please have a very peaceful festive season. Bye-bye.